Good morning everyone, it's Phil again. Now bear with me because I'm on my own, so I'm doing all the filming and editing and everything all on my Todd, so see how it goes. Hopefully it's okay. So how are you getting on with the paper planes and the sock juggling and all the other stuff? I hope you're having fun, and I'd like to hear from you if you can. And I did hear from a good friend of mine, Andrew, who splits his time between the UK and New Zealand. He's out in New Zealand at the moment, self-isolating, and they're having a pretty tough time, I think. But he's enjoying the videos, and he asked me when we're going to get on to some sailing, which is his particular love. And so what I thought was, today we'd tackle a new topic, which is halfway house between the aeroplanes of the last topic and sailing. So this topic is how to fly a float plane, which is something I learnt to do over in Florida 30 odd years ago. Anyway, I want to show you this certificate on my wall, and we'll look at it a bit more closely. Okay, I'll see you in a moment. So before we do that, I just wanted to explain where I am, because I'm 300 meters from Saltons Marina, which is where British Overseas Airways Corporation, that's BA as it is now, used to have their seaplane operation, flying in and out of Poole Harbour to Europe, Africa, and all the way to Australia. And that's because Southampton was being bombed in the Second World War, so they brought all the operations here to Poole until 1948. So there's a lot of history with float plane flying, and it goes back a long way. And one thing we can look at is the Schneider Trophy races, which happened between 1913 and 31 down in Southampton on Southampton Water. And the reason why is because in those days propellers were not adjustable, so you couldn't have a propeller that was both a coarse pitch for high-speed cruise or a fine pitch for takeoff and a fast climb. So they had to set one setting and live with it. And of course they wanted top speed, and that meant that takeoffs took a lot of space. So the reason seaplane flying began in earnest was because they had the room on the water, miles and miles of it, with which to have a slow takeoff and steadily get up to the high speeds they needed. And so that's where it all began. And Reginald Mitchell, who designed the Spitfire, was responsible for one of the most beautiful designs that we'll look at later, which became eventually the Spitfire. So this book from my library shows the Schneider Trophy. I think the original is actually in the Science Museum in London, but if you look at this picture you can see just how beautiful and lovely that trophy was. So this second book, the Dorling Kindersley The Aircraft book, is a book I had a hand in making. I used to help out at an aeroplane collection, and if we turn to one of the pages here, you will see that this page on the SE-5A from the First World War, there was lots of great photos taken, all these beautiful photos here, and I helped them put all those photos together, which was a lot of fun. But anyway, what I really wanted to show you was this page over here, if I can get to it, which is this one just here. Now this is about the Schneider Trophy races. Here they are, this is what they look like, very elegant, beautiful. And here's the one that inspired Reginald Mitchell to create the Spitfire. And this is the Supermarine S6B from 1930 with a top speed of over 400 miles an hour. And you can see the size of that propeller and the coarseness of it, how wide the blades are. And that's what allowed it to fly so fast, but obviously it needed a lot of room to take off from the water. So you may remember on my office wall there's lots of certificates about different things I've been involved with, and this gives you a feel for some of them, and we can look at them and discuss them when we've got time. But the one we're looking at just now is this one just here, and I hope you can read it. It's a certificate from Jack Brown Seaplane Base near Orlando in Florida. And this shows me getting a single engine seaplane rating to add to my American pilot's license, and this was back in 1992, so quite a while ago. And we're going to look at this in more detail, and I'm going to show you or tell you how we learned to fly float planes. So here we are back down in my kitchen, which is where we did the flying of the model planes. And I'm just going to walk you through the kitchen to a photo on the wall here, which was taken by my good friend Alex. And this was taken at Jack Brown's Seaplane Base. And you can see this is a photo that Alex took of the plane that's in the foreground, which is the Piper Cub that he had been flying. And as he took the photo of his plane, he accidentally snapped at the same moment myself flying past on the lake, messing around on one float. But it makes a really lovely photo that brings back a lot of memories, and it's a joyous place, Jack Brown's in Florida. So how do you fly a float plane? Good question. Well, I don't have any float plane models other than a very little tiny one that came from Alex, which is this one. I don't know if you can see it. But that's a bit hard to show you the things I need to show you. So I think we'll probably try and use this Cessna here, which is actually the aeroplane I learned to fly in originally over in America. And this is a bit bigger so we can see what I'm talking about. But the problem is this model has 3 wheels on it, and of course float planes don't have wheels. So you've got to imagine this without this one on the nose, that's completely missing, and instead of these 2 wheels underneath here, we have 2 long floats that go parallel to the aeroplane, which support it on the water. And those floats are really important because not only do they give buoyancy, but they also give stability when the aeroplane is on the water. And they have built into them what's called a chine, and that is like a step in the design of the float, which means that when the aeroplane gets to a certain speed, it's a bit like a speedboat. It can come up onto a plane above the water, so it's planing across the top of the water rather than ploughing through it, and those steps allow that to happen more easily. I'll show you a photo of that. So that photo was of a Piper J3 Cub from the 1940s, one of the ones that I flew at Jack Brown's. Beautiful old aeroplane, real stick and rudder stuff. Didn't have a control yoke, it just has a stick that you hold between your legs and rudder pedals that you can operate, and a throttle on the side, and off you go. But they don't have a lot of excess power, so you have to get all your techniques spot on. Otherwise you don't really get very far. Now the first thing with float plane flying is on the water, obviously the aeroplane is susceptible to the wind, so even if the boat is just sat on the water gently idling, the wind is going to be blowing it around and it's going to try and weathercock. So if the wind is coming this way, obviously the aeroplane is going to try and naturally weathercock because of the rudder on the tail here. It's going to want to sit into the wind and then just get slowly blown backwards with the wind. So there are different ways of taxiing a float plane, and float planes have on the bottom of the floats that run underneath, they have a water rudder, and that's got a separate control in the cockpit, and it's very important that you don't forget that control before takeoff, because if you take off with the water rudders down, it can get very messy. So you lift the water rudders up before you take off. and different ways of taxiing. So you can just taxi around fairly slowly if the wind is light, and just use enough power to keep moving. You've got to be very careful because, for example, if you're coming into a dock, you've got to allow for the wind to be blowing the aeroplane onto the dock, and you've got a rotating propeller which you don't want to get anywhere near the dock itself. And there are other ways of taxiing. You can accelerate so that the float plane starts to go along through the water, and as it gets faster, with the control stick held back, then the nose will come up and she will ride up on top of the water onto the plane, and that's fast taxiing. And obviously you need to be careful that you don't go so fast that you take off, but you can then taxi around on top of the water. And of course you can go around bends, but it feels very weird to an aeroplane pilot to go around a bend like that because you are turning without any banking. So there's no angle on the aeroplane, it just sits flat on the water, but nevertheless skids round in a turn. So that takes a bit of getting used to. So taxiing is the first art you have to learn. One time you do use taxiing to your own benefit is if the water is very glassy and very smooth, then certainly with something like a J3 Piper Cub, because they don't have much power, if you try and take off, then because the water is smooth, there's so much surface tension or suction between the floats and the water that it's very hard for the aeroplane to create enough power to get off the water. So what you have to do is a couple of things. You can taxi around as much as you like and try and break up the water, and create lots of little ripples which will help to break the surface tension as you accelerate. And the other thing that you can do, and we did in the Piper Cubs, which is really quite fun, is you start your takeoff run like this and you accelerate into the wind. As you get faster, there's air flowing over the wings, which then allows you to move the controls to lift one wing up, which of course then releases one float from the water. So you then only have half the suction between the aeroplane and the water, which means you can then accelerate along the water on one float until you reach flying speed, and then you can take off. So that's an interesting technique, and a lot of these float plane techniques really go back to proper stick and rudder flying, where you have to really have good coordination and you have to think what you're doing. It's not like just flying a very bog standard trainer aeroplane. So that's why it's so much fun. So we imagine that we've now taken off and we're in the climb. Now obviously those big floats underneath the aeroplane add weight and a lot of drag. Although they're quite aerodynamically shaped, you still feel it, especially in an aeroplane like a J3 Cub with not much extra power. And the turning and the handling of the aeroplane is reasonably standard. It's affected a little bit by the floats, but not too much. So then we look at different landing techniques, and that's when it gets very exciting. So for example, when you come into land in a conventional way in a seaplane, you maintain a nice approach speed and a rate of descent, and as you get nearer the water you start a gentle flare. So if my arm is the water level, start a gentle flare and hold the nose up just a little and let the aeroplane just sink onto the water surface. And there is so much drag from the water that the aeroplane slows down very quickly, and you keep the control stick back in your tummy and pull the throttle to idle, and you will stop in a very short distance. One problem there is if the water is very clear and very still. And where I learned in Florida, they have lots of little, what they call pot lakes. It's the land of 1,000 lakes. Many of them are quite small. But the thing is, the water is very, very clear sometimes, especially when it's calm. And the problem for the pilot coming into land is that they can see through the water down to the surface of the lake bed itself. So the problem is, if they're trying to judge the flare to land, then they don't know when to flare, because they're not looking at the water surface here, they're looking at the bottom of the lake bed, which might be down here. So that's very dangerous. So on a glassy water landing, the idea is to set up a very controlled descent at a set speed, at a rate of descent of around 200 to 300 feet a minute, and the pilot just keeps looking out at the horizon and doesn't try to flare. It's basically a controlled crash landing. So you fly down, and when you feel the aeroplane has touched the water, then stick back into the stomach, throttle off, and there you are, you've arrived. So that's a very interesting technique to land, where you haven't really been involved in the actual landing event itself. You just set the aeroplane up so it can land. Other problems that you have with seaplane or floatplane flying, and one that we discovered in Florida is quite fun to have a go at. Because the lakes are so small in Florida, it creates its own sort of problems. So if you are coming into land in a floatplane into one of the small lakes in Florida, then it's not a problem. You land and the drag from the float slows you down very quickly, so you might have stopped on the water within 30-40 meters. Not a problem. But the problem then comes, what happens when you try and take off and get out? Because the pot lake might only be 100-200 meters across. That's when it gets exciting, because what you have to do then is to learn a takeoff technique, which really takes quite a bit of practice and skill. And what it means is that you take off in a circle. So you have to learn how to accelerate on the water and do a skidding fast taxi type turn and keep going around that circle, staying within the confines of the pot lake until you have enough airspeed to then lift off the water, take off and climb. And of course that takes a lot of coordination, because not only have you got to correctly make the circle, but you've also got to time it so that you have the right correct airspeed just as you get round the part of the circle where the aeroplane is coming back into the wind, so it's then in the right position to take off, because you never take off downwind if you can avoid it. Now obviously on big lakes, they're so wide that you can generally take off and land dead into wind, so you're not having to allow for any crosswinds. One problem there, of course, is landing on rivers, which tend to be unidirectional and not always into the wind. So that requires another set of skills. And that's a lot of that sort of flying happens up in Alaska, and the bush pilots do that sort of thing. But for basic floatplane flying, like I have done over in Florida, these are some of the basic techniques you learn. So the takeoff from a small pot lake with a circling takeoff is really quite fun, and it's a bit like trying to pat your head, rub your tummy and recite the Lord's Prayer at the same time. You're trying to do so many things that trying to juggle all those requirements takes a bit of doing. Anyway, that gives you some idea of the complexities, but also the fun of learning to fly float planes. And I can really recommend that if you ever go out to Florida, you can go to Jack Brown's seaplane and just have a fun flight in one, and you'll love it. You're flying low over the water. You can look out for gators and crocodiles, and it really is like no other flying, and it's the flying that I enjoy most of all. So that's, you know, a look at floatplane flying, and I really hope you've enjoyed it. So I've got a few clips of me flying in float planes, not very much, but a little bit that you can have a look at. A couple with some photos, both from Jack Brown's, and I did some float plane flying down in Biscarrosse in France, which was a very historic place where they used to fly across the Atlantic to South America with large seaplanes. So I'll just show you these video clips and a couple of photos, then I'll tell you about a brilliant book. So I've got with me here an absolutely fantastic book. It's called The Voyage of the Southern Sun. I hope you can see that okay. It's written by a guy called Michael Smith, and if you look at his aeroplane you can see that it's an amphibious aeroplane. So those wheels on the side rotate upwards out of the way when he lands on the water, and it's got little outrigger floats that you can see on the end of the wings. But also, when he wants to land on the lander on a runway, those wheels rotate back down underneath and it becomes a more conventional land aeroplane. He flew in 2015 all the way around the world, and it's a fantastic read and a brilliant story. And he's a really inspirational guy, so I can't recommend that enough. It's called Voyage of the Southern Sun. So if you can get that delivered, have a great read and you'll know a lot more about floatplane flying. That's all for now, so remember you can get in touch, you can send me stuff, I'd like to see it, and look out for the next one, hopefully in a couple of days' time. Take care, bye bye, stay healthy.